Thatcherism implanted serious weaknesses in our economy, in our society, utterly disastrous for our country.
Given all the damage that you felt they'd inflicted, it must have been very, very difficult to understand how people could vote again for the Tories after 13 years, given all that.
Well, one reason was that Margaret Thatcher had gone, and the other reason was that I hadn't gone.
The early stages of your leadership were defined in many ways. The battle with militant, but there was also the miners' strike.
This strike will not be successful, and worse, will end in disaster if it lacks legitimacy, which can only be gained with the ballot.
That 92 defeat, how devastating that must have been.
I know you get through it, but do you ever actually get over something quite as crushing as that?
Welcome to The Restless Politics, leading with me, Rory Stewart.
And with me, Alastair Campbell, and we're delighted to be joined by Neil Kinnock, who is one of the most recognisable faces in British politics, and even more so, perhaps, one of the most recognisable voices.
My voice is much prettier than my face.
There you go. He was an MP for 25 years. He was perhaps the finest orator of his generation. He was leader of the Labour Party from 1983 to 1992, and therefore a key figure in the long, slow, painful journey from opposition to government after the Thatcher major era. He's now 83. He is proudly Welsh. He is passionately internationalist. He went on to be Vice President of the European Commission, Chair of the British Council, and now sits in the House of Lords. Full disclosure, he's one of my oldest and dearest and closest friends, though we have had our moments. I was very, very touched that he asked me to speak at the funeral of his wonderful wife, Glenys, 2 years ago. Theirs was a remarkable partnership, and she a formidable political figure in her own right. But we've got a lot to get through. And Rory, where do you want to start? We normally start at the beginning.
Well, thank you for coming. Can we start with your childhood? And I'm going to be a bit cheeky before I get you onto it, which is that we've interviewed a number of Labour MPs, and there seems to be a general competition for how grim the childhood can be. I don't know whether that's necessary in the Labour Party, but we've done sort of 6 of them, and all of them, the levels of extremity and poverty that they went through are just sort of out-compete with each other. Tell us a little bit about your own childhood.
I had a wonderful childhood. I had the equivalent of a silver spoon as an only child, with, for most of my childhood, all of my childhood indeed, from the age of about 3, both parents working, and with supportive grandparents and uncles and aunts stretching into the distance, all of whom were kindly and indulgent in the sense that they always treated me as a kind of equal, which is, I didn't realize at the time, was immensely advantageous, very comforting. So all that was great. I mean, we didn't have a car or stuff like that. And I bought our first television when I was 15, out of various bits and pieces that I earned in various ways. So, wealthy we weren't, poor we weren't either, and deprived is not a word you could ever apply to me.
But you were an only child.
Yes.
Was that an economic decision?
Partly. My mother had 2 miscarriages. One before I was born and one when I was about 2. So there wasn't an intention strictly to have a very tiny family, but that was part of the consideration. And I think typical of their generation, my mother was one of 4 children who survived. My grandmother had 9 pregnancies and 4 children survived into adulthood. And my father was one of 7 surviving children out of 11 pregnancies. They had been deprived, there's no doubt about that. They'd experienced the deepest, direst poverty, and part of their limitation, like many others in their generation, arose from the fact they had worked out, like a lot of other people, that if you had fewer kids, there was no need to spread around the very limited income quite as much.
Could you give us a sense, looking back now, on what the Wales of the late 40s, 50s were for you, and then maybe what the Wales of your parents' generation were, what had changed. I guess their childhood would have been in the 20s and 30s, is that right?
Yes, that's right. My father was born in 1907, my mother in 1910. So you can understand what they endured. My mother left school at 16 in 1926 in the middle of the general strike, in which, of course, her father was involved. He was a coal miner. She left because they were totally penniless. And she therefore had to find not only a job, but somewhere to live. So instead of becoming the doctor, which she wanted to be, she got a scholarship to the grammar school in Aberdare in Glamorganshire. And instead of becoming the doctor, she became a nurse because that enabled her to go and live in the nursing home in Merthyr Tydfil. The huge change between the 20s, 30s, and the late 40s, and then the 50s and beyond was full employment. It was a gigantic alteration. And of course, it doesn't just shift people's living standards, it completely alters the mentality in a very positive direction. That was evident in South Wales, even to a kid of maybe 8 to 10 years of age, because of parental and grandparents' reference to what life was like before, often with a great deal of humor involved in it, at the sheer hopelessness of the situation. Then it was difficult not to understand this gigantic leap that had occurred in the wake of the war.
And your dad was a miner. Both your grandfathers were miners.
Yeah, and several of my uncles.
And several of your uncles.
Yeah.
You assumed as a kid you might be a miner?
I was never allowed to even think.
Because of your dad?
Because of a general resistance amongst aspiring parents to the idea of their boy going underground. The phrase that I heard thousands of times.
Because it was a horrible way of life?
I'll give you a direct bit of evidence. I was desperate to get out of school. I was in a hyper-creamed grammar school.
This is the famous Eton of Wales that Lloyd George refers to.
That's what Lloyd George called it, yes. The Lewis Boys School in Pingham. It sought in some ways to emulate what they thought a public school was like. Hence the title given by Lloyd George in the years before, I think, the First World War. But I was desperate to get out of school. I detested school until I got into the sixth form. And so I applied for everything that I thought would be acceptable and interesting to me. The army. And when my parents found out about that, they became very irritated, not because they were against the army, but because my mother said, when you go to university, you can join the army, you can join the TA, you can become an officer, but you get your degree first. Okay. Then I tried the Metropolitan Police Force because I just reached the minimum height. And when they found out about that, the letter of reply inviting me for an interview, they went mad about that as well, not because they were against the cops, but because I would fare much better if I went to university first. And when I got admitted to the management apprenticeship scheme of the National Coal Board, they went ballistic. I mean, it was the worst breakdown in relations I ever had with my parents. And it lasted for weeks. The very idea that I would betray their concept of the future by even spending the few weeks that you did spend as part of the apprenticeship underground.
Maybe this is unfair, but the impression you're giving me is that you were a sort of bright, precocious, only child with adoring parents who wanted you to do wonderful things.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it made me very, very lazy. I mean, I read voraciously and I followed every sport that I could turn my eyes to. And I loved chasing girls and I adored rock and roll and all that stuff. I never did any work at all until I got pathetically bad O-levels and realized that that application wasn't something that simply applied to painting.
You had to repeat a year.
Yeah, that's right. Which was ignominious, of course. Anyway, I got decent O levels and it was all right.
Just before we leave your parents, your mum was quite religious.
Well, no, in a funny way she was. She was a Christian socialist, but because she had to work most Sundays as the district nurse, and because she didn't really get on with very chapel people.
What is a chapel person?
Well, someone who goes to chapel frequently on a Sunday, but tries to advertise their righteousness throughout the remainder of the week. My mother could spell righteousness backwards if you wanted her to, but she didn't have much time for it. And so consequently, she would very occasionally, high days, holidays, if I was performing in chapel or something like that, she would turn up. But she was rigorously Christian who didn't go to chapel, which I challenged her once or twice on it. And she just told me it was absolutely nothing to do with me. And that ended the conversation with my mother.
We've really enjoyed interviewing actually some leading Welsh Labour figures, but I'd love you to give a sense of what Wales was like as a nation, what the Welsh Labour Party was like when you were growing up.
The feelings of nation, certainly when I was growing up, were entirely cultural and were manifested most obviously, graphically, in relation to sport. I mean, the people of Wales had their heroes, which of course included Aneurin Bevan as probably the greatest hero, certainly in modern times.
Interesting, that's a politician as well.
Yes, that's
Not
right.
many places have politicians as their heroes.
Yeah, but don't forget, Nye was a lot more than a politician. He was a figure. He was representative of a whole culture, class, location, geography, stratum in society, the whole thing. And he wasn't alone in that. James Griffiths and Ness Edwards and other political figures were cherished, admired, in some cases adored, simply because they were from where they were from and got to where they got. I mean, that was very significant. And in some senses, it does reflect, if not epitomize, the attitude of the people of Wales to being Welsh at the time.
For international listeners, Aneurin Bevan is the man who created the National Health Service, one of Britain's greatest achievements.
Yes, and did it alongside being a poet of politics, a rhetorical magician, and a very challenging and audacious figure. So he was a cavalier, really, and he did the Puritan job of the bureaucracy, negotiation, slogging exchanges of creating this absolutely amazing edifice.
The other person, of course, that listeners will be concentrating on is Lloyd George, with that extraordinary vision in Parliament Square, who also sounds a bit like that. I mean, is there some Welsh tradition we're talking about here, which links you, Nye Bevan, Lloyd George? What is this tradition?
Well, I think it's more a linkage of coincidence and convenience than anything that is organically Welsh. There are ways to demonstrate, Alastair and I have talked about this before, that there are characteristics of Welsh, the language, the sentence construction, the dependence on the oral tradition, the contribution made by nonconformist religion, the self-rule that was characteristic of the chapels, the way people learned the arts of democracy, negotiation, advocacy, by that means, even when they'd left school at 11 years of age. You can put all that together and throw in a little bit of nostalgia and set it to music, and you've got a wonderful opera. And you can make a real substantial story out of the rhetorical gifts of Welsh people. And of course, it might be true, and it might be Hollywood coincidence. I've never been completely sure. There is something different about Wales, which you would expect. The geography, the way in which by definition, smaller communities are created with their own intimacies, their own culture, their own identity, their own flamboyance or diffidence, never deference. There are things that make up ready-made audiences, difficulties of contact, the topography isn't friendly to travel, all those things mixed in, warp and weft. And you could philosophize about them for hours. And people do. They write PhDs about it, which I'm in danger of doing by an overlong answer.
But it is true, if you think about it, that there is probably a disproportionate number of Welsh great actors as well.
Yes, that's true.
So actors and politicians, Wales has probably produced more great ones than most.
Like there are a lot of jazz players from Chicago. I mean,
although your sort of obsession with Welshness, when I was writing a series about the greatest sports people in the world, Neil tried to persuade me that John Charles was a better player than Diego Maradona, which you failed
on your
to do.
deathbed, you will confess that is the truth.
Is it that
Yes.
you never played with John Charles?
I didn't ever play with John Charles anyway. Let's just see. You leave school.
Rory, I can tell you're his friend because you've hit him at the sorest.
No, it's not
point.
sore. It's not sore. I'm so proud of that.
Maradona used to speak of nothing else.
It's true.
I played.
Apparently on,
I played with
Maradona's
Campbell.
deathbed.
Yeah,
It's exactly.
Thank you. Right, calm down. So we get you then eventually with your parents' exhortation, you get to university, you do industrial relations, and that's where you meet Glenys.
Yeah.
And we'll maybe talk about Glenys a bit later, but then you become an MP. Okay.
Very, very young. I mean, you're
27.
I was 28. I was 27 when I was selected.
When you were selected. And the thing
28.
And you're coming into a Labour bench where there are quite a lot of older trade union men who are
Yes,
coming in their
yes.
50s, right?
Yeah, and war veterans who were by this time in their 60s, not old men, and full-blown war heroes who never talked about it. It was daunting. Yes, that's true.
And the other thing, I don't even know this, Rory, Neil's selection for what was then the constituency of Bedwellty, in the selection, there were, I think, 4, got down to 2, and in the vote, it was a dead heat.
74 each. Yes.
So dead heat, and they didn't know what to do, so you had to sort of do another speech.
Yeah, well, what happened was Glenys was in the selection conference as the chairman of the Young Socialists. That's how young we were. And all my mates turned down, what do we do, Glenn? What do we do? What do we do? And she said, oh, let's get it over with. Let them go again. So they decided another 10 minutes speech and questions after that for each of us, myself and the guy I would have voted for had I not been running.
Who was the other guy?
His name was Lance Rogers. He was the miners' agent, and he was a veteran of the Spanish Civil War. That's how long ago it was.
So he was much older than you.
Lance had been on the front with Jack Jones when he was 19 in 1938. And I was up against this guy. And we had 74 votes each. So we made further speeches. We spun the coin. He went first, I went second. Extraordinarily, and I didn't know this, of course, because I couldn't hear what he was saying, he attacked me. And I went in and made a speech about the need for a new district general hospital, which continued. We got a health centre from the Blair Brown government, a very comprehensive health centre. It was after my day as the Member of Parliament, but the need existed.
It finally came 30 years after your election.
Yeah, that's right.
Thanks to New Labour.
Yeah, I'm now a member of the House of Lords. That is an eye blink of progress, 30 years. Anyway, we did it all again. I was asked, Alastair, I think, knows this. I was asked a question after I'd made the speech about the hospital. Mr. Kinnock, you're just out of college. You've never worked in industry properly. How could you cope with the hurly-burly of being our representative? This is one of Lance Rogers' guys, obviously. So I said, well, if my parents had kept me in school all the years that they did, and you and they had allowed me to go to university, And I graduated with my degree and gone up to Markham Colliery and asked the manager for a start. You wouldn't be selecting me, you'd be certifying me. Anyway, the roof came off. And that's how I won, by 76 votes to 70.
If you'd lost by one vote, would that have been it?
No, I would rather go again then. Partly because S.O. Davis, the Labour Member of Parliament for Merthyr Tydfil, then in his 80s, and a man of great accomplishment and of almost equal vanity, a lovely old guy in many ways, had invited myself and Glenys to tea on a Sunday in his residence in Merthyr Tydfil. And out of courtesy, and because Mrs. Sephora Davis, his wife, was the chairman of the Merthyr Tydfil branch of the Workers' Educational Association, where they had a big branch, and I used to do lectures and organize courses and so on. So Dennis and I turned up on this Sunday afternoon. I would have been I was about 26 and she was 24 maybe. And with a degree of trepidation. And this lovely big old house in Merthyr Tydfil. And we had tea with all the things you'd expect, including Welsh cakes. And salmon and salad, of course. Anyway, Esso eventually says, would you like to come into the front room? So we go into the front room. I'm not kidding you. There were 2 gigantic aspidistras in the room. It was like stepping back into the 1880s. It was quite extraordinary. And I've had good reports about you, young man, from Mrs. Sephora Davis. So I've been giving consideration to what should occur in the event of my retirement. And I think you could be a suitable replacement.
And this was a man who's the age you are now, back then.
Yes,
exactly.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
A veteran of the 1920s and 30s when he'd been a miner's agent, real tearaway, a man of great erudition and endless reading and quite remarkable figure. And he was sort of taking me up onto the mount and showing me all of the limitless
the temptations.
Yes.
Yeah.
So you get to Parliament and you become a bit of a rebel.
You become the sort of Jeremy Corbyn of your generation.
Oh, do not say
Good
that.
God.
Rory.
I'm going to
Rory.
challenge you to a duel. It's bagpipes at dawn.
You rebel something astonishing, like sort of 70 times. I mean, literally
79.
You almost beat Corbyn's record.
Yeah, but it was almost entirely about 2 things. One, with the Labour government, the minority Labour government, I felt that their public expenditure policy was entirely wrong. As events proved, I'm not claiming any great Keynesian insight, but it was obvious to me that they were wrong. And years later, Dennis was a beloved friend. Dennis Healy was the Chancellor and said we were all out of our tiny Chinese minds and so on and so forth. Acknowledged that we were more right than the Treasury was. Anyway.
And the other one was devolution.
And the other one was devolution.
But you spent nearly 10 years choosing, basically, to be a rebel on the backbenches rather than going into government. I mean,
No, they kept on crashing into me with proposals that didn't really suit my constituents. I mean, you being an MP, and that is your fundamental duty. That's it. In fact, there's not much else of an excuse for rebelling when you've been elected as a member of a political party. You do owe loyalty, but you also owe your judgment. And without being arrogant, sometimes the judgment contradicts that of the government. So you have to do what your duty requires.
Were they more understanding of rebellion? I mean, in my time in Parliament, the idea that the whips would put up with someone rebelling more than 70 times in 10 years is kind of unimaginable. My career was basically scotched by rebelling once. I was left on the backbenches for 5 years.
Yeah, quite. Well, I'll tell you what it got to, not over the public expenditure stuff, but over devolution. During the period of the debate on the Wales Bill and the Scotland Bill, and my resistance to the government's proposals, the whips used to ask me if I'd like the evening off, so that at least they paid me, and it didn't make any difference in the Labour numbers. So I saw a lot more of my children, which was wonderful, than I otherwise would.
So you would have rebelled even more. The 70s just the sort of,
79.
Yeah.
79.
Yeah,
Yeah,
but-
it would have been hundreds if you
Yes.
hadn't been going back to see your kids.
Yeah,
well, Corbyn was hundreds.
well, I mean,
Do you feel proud and flattered to be compared with your current
I just
serving
challenged-
MP?
I've just challenged Rory to a duel. And he's my member of parliament.
Oh, he's your member of parliament.
In North Islington.
Yeah.
Right.
Just on devolution, I was rereading Martin Westlake's biography of you over the last few days, and I'd just forgotten just how passionate you were about devolution and just how much you felt that the road that the many in the Welsh Labour Party were on would lead to devolution, which you then foresaw or feared the breakup of the United Kingdom and Wales suffering the most out of that.
And explain your position. Yeah. What was your position?
Well, it was fundamentally this, that if decentralisation was good, which it is and was, and I wish we had it, we still haven't, then it was good for everybody. And there were dangers for Scotland and for Wales, which was my particular concern, in having the form of devolution or decentralisation that was being offered. I thought it was counterfeit because of several reasons. First of all, it would provide any party that was resistant to Whitehall or Westminster, didn't matter which party it was, with a permanent excuse for opposing the proposals of, and what concerned me, a Labour government, either because they didn't have enough power or because they had the power but they didn't have enough money. But in any case, they would always acquit themselves of any accusations of incompetent government by having that permanent excuse. And secondly, I believed that the form of devolution being offered wasn't a serious effort to decentralisation, because it was denied to England, obviously, and was only a panic reaction to some by-election results in Scotland and Wales, which I still consider back in the 1970s was the case. And the most important thing was that any degree of separation, that form of distinctiveness, would disadvantage Wales in any negotiations over financial settlement. And that proved to be the case with the Barnett formula, who's a dear friend of mine, Joel, dear friend of mine, who became the most caustic critic of his own proposals.
One of the things, I guess, just to sort of, before we move on, just to place the Labour Party of the 1970s and try to explain what it was. I mean, for somebody like me, I was born in 1973. I look back at this, and the issues that seem to have animated people were issues like devolution, but there were also issues like Europe.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then there's this weird sense that in some ways your voting record, your reputation in the 70s doesn't seem totally different from that of Michael Foot or Tony Benn. But by the time we get into the 80s, you're clearly a very different type
It was
of person.
very different from Michael Foot and Tony Benn.
Yeah. So tell us a bit about those people. Tell us about what the Labour... I mean, can you divide the Labour Party into 2 or 3 different camps in the 1970s? What was the politics of the party at that time?
Well, broadly, the left, which is a tribunite left, with a tiny fringe that emerged of ultra-leftists, of people who had a devout belief in extra-parliamentary activity. The leader of that very small faction in the parliamentary party, much broader outside Parliament, was Tony Benn. But when you refer to him in your question, and I intervened, it was because Tony Benn was a member of the shadow cabinet in 70 to 74, and then the cabinet from 74 to 1979, and of course didn't rebel in any sense whatsoever, although constantly agitated as the man who could redeem the Labour Party and enable it to recover, as he put it, from its drift to social democracy.
And what does that mean? I mean, this sounds a bit alien now in the 1970s.
Listen, is garbage. It's gobbledygook. The idea that there was some great ideologically fundamental divide in the Labour Party derived from the fact that Tony, in the wake of the 1970 general election defeat, discovered a form of assertive socialism, as he saw it, which did involve being resistant to the European community, becoming for the first time in his life a unilateral disarmer, and becoming an unconditional supporter of union action that resisted the Prices and Incomes Acts and policies to try and control and rationalize inflation. And that gave him a reputation, because he's a man of great ability, fine sense of humor, charismatic personality, and a nice guy who became, I think, unfortunately focused on the possibility of running the Labour Party. He always put, it seemed to me, a much greater emphasis on power in the Labour Party than power for the Labour Party.
And he so you're saying that he actually, in a sense, became more radical as he got older?
Yes, he said that himself, almost in those words.
Right. Then there's another thing which Alastair's always resisting and analysing because it annoys him so much, and it may annoy you so much you don't want to analyse it either. I notice when I sit down with new Labour ministers, they will grumble about Corbyn, they'll grumble about Trotskyites coming into the party, they'll grumble about entries. All of this stuff is unfamiliar to a lot of our listeners, and Alastair won't ever explain it because he just irritates them so much. Will you please try to explain roughly who these people were?
Briefly,
yeah.
Without a PhD thesis.
If I can manage to be brief, yes. Yeah. People described as Trotskyites, and sometimes think of themselves as followers of Leon Trotsky, tend to be on the ultra-left fringe of the Labour Party. They have always existed. From the earliest days of the Labour Party, way back in the wake of the First World War, there have always been people who espoused the idea of revolutionary change and believed that if they established their policies and made their arguments, the time would come of such frustration and rejection of capitalism and its mores and attached cultural subordination, that the people of Britain would want to embrace a party of the ultra-left with ultra-left leadership. And they've never been particularly well organized, except for a short period in the mid to late 1970s with a Labour government, of course, because they could then mobilize the resentments and disappointments about a government striving as a minority government, and into the early 80s, where they got a complete grip on Liverpool Council and substantial influence in a few other parts of the United Kingdom.
Does that help you, Rory? Do you understand now?
No, I do. I think so. No, it's fascinating. It's completely fascinating because that wasn't part of the story of New Labour. But when I sit down with Jack, when I sit down with Jack Straw, he will grumble about Trotskyites, he'll grumble about Jeremy Corbyn, but with the history of this, I didn't get at all.
No, but the point that Neil makes there about getting into the 80s, I mean, we're getting slightly out of sync here, but one of the sort of defining moments of Neil's leadership was this taking on the militant tendency. And
this was the speech that you saw in Bournemouth, which won you over to Neil and the Labour Party.
Well, I'd always been won over to Neil and always been won over to the Labour Party, but it certainly inspired me to get more involved than I had thus far been.
And you told us in Bournemouth about this.
I did.
Indeed. Okay, right. I'm going to hand back to you on the 1970s, because as you say, we're getting ahead of ourselves.
What I wanted to ask you, Neil, so when you get into Parliament, you saw very close up and got to know very well three of the leaders at the time. I just went very, literally in a sentence, Harold Wilson, Jim Callaghan, Michael Foot.
Harold, utterly brilliant, but assailed constantly by self-doubt for reasons I could never really fathom, and brought down eventually by illness, because in any other set of circumstances, if he'd sustained his full energy and capacity, he would have only moved when he wanted to. Jim, again in a funny way, a man with self-doubts, although huge capacities, Jim was borne down throughout his life by the fact that his background was too poor to enable him to go to university. And he really did envy those of us who came from a generation where it had become much more usual for kids from working class backgrounds to get there. When I went there, it was still only 3 or 4% of the age cohort were going to university, but that was huge by comparison with Jim's day. And despite his accomplishments, the fact that I still think he's the only person to have had the 3 great offices of Prime Minister, Foreign Secretary and Home Secretary, he still had this inner doubt about his abilities. And I did have 1 or 2 conversations over the years with him in which I was very dismissive as somebody who'd worked in adult education about the idea that he could be a full, commanding intellectual presence without a degree. And he simply didn't agree with me. It's
And
quite
Michael?
extraordinary. And Michael was shy and flamboyant, was coy and adventurous, and someone who had a fundamental belief in the superiority of British radicalism, progressive radicalism. And so from an early age, even when he was a member of the Liberal Party and Liberal president of the Oxford Union, for instance, he had this belief in emancipation of the people economically, socially, and culturally, which was impeded by the system, which when he became a shipping clerk in Liverpool in the early 1930s and encountered desperate, desolating poverty, turned him into a very radical socialist. He was a great man who had unremitting loyalty to his friends and one of the best levels of understanding of young people I've ever encountered in a politician.
Which brings us to the Tories of the 70s. And I wondered
Well,
whether...
hold on.
Yeah,
Before we leave that,
Okay, yeah.
you joined the Labour Party
I did.
when Michael Foot was leader.
Yeah, I can understand that.
Yeah, exactly.
So
well, I love the...
I would to know...
I love the intellectualism. I love the writing. I love the whole sort.
Yes,
the sense of
that's
the man.
right.
Yeah.
I mean, his pen was magical in the sense that what he produced was wonderful. His writing was indecipherable. And Una, his secretary, was, I used to say she was responsible for his greatness because she'd written it all. How she ever understood his handwriting, God only knows.
So Neil, let's just have a look at some of the Tories of the 70s. I don't know who you'd select, but I'd love to know about Ted Heath. I'd love to know a bit about Enoch Powell, maybe Willie Whitelaw. I mean, give us a sense of these people that you saw when you arrived in the 70s.
What you saw is what you got with Willie. He was robustness on legs. But like a lot of his generation, and this includes Ted Heath and Francis Pym and Lord Carrington and others, some of them had come from aristocratic backgrounds, some from prosperous middle class backgrounds, and got to 1939, usually in Oxbridge, without much encounter with the normality of life. Because to be prosperous in their upbringing in the 20s and 30s was simply not to encounter many of the realities of life that were commonplace to huge majorities. They then served in the war, and it, in many cases, altered their perception of their fellow countrymen and women. So although they were conservatives, when 1945 came and the gigantic Labour majority and the extraordinary accomplishments of the Attlee government in terms of full employment, the welfare state, the development of the economy, the subsidizing and support of basic industries, they were the people who persuaded the Conservative leadership not to drop any of it, to oppose it vociferously, but in government, not to change it. And by the time we get to the 1970s, these people are the elder statesmen of the Conservative Party. They included Willie, who had been a guards officer, or maybe he was in a tank regiment, but he'd had a notable war and learned a great deal that took him away from his background and his public school and all the rest of it, and put him very firmly, feet on both ground, in the centre ground of politics. Now, the same thing applied to quite a lot of the others. Ted Heath made a temporary departure from that consensual politics in the period before the 1970 election, when he embraced what became known as Selsdon Man, after the hotel in which they drew up this manifesto, which was very radically right-wing. Dropped after 2 years in government because unemployment had unbelievably reached 1 million, which provoked absolute outrage in a generation that had thought they were never going to see that number of unemployed again. And it daunted Ted. Ted did a U-turn, which then in turn generated serious and bitter resentment in parts of the Conservative Party, which is why he was overthrown and replaced by Margaret Thatcher.
Neil, right at the heart of the moment that you are taking over leadership is this new party is emerging called the SDP. And the SDP is this incredible thing. You know, more than 20 MPs defect to this new centrist sort of liberalist party.
And only one Tory.
And you end up with, you know, these huge beasts, Roy Jenkins, David Owen, Bill Rogers, Shirley Williams, leaving the cabinet, going to it. They get up to 25% of the polls. The Labour Party's down to 23% in the polls. Looks for a moment as though the Labour Party's now in third place and it could be finished and this whole new political force emerge. In other words, it feels a bit like it must feel for the Tories at the moment with reform. So what lessons did you learn from that and how to deal with them? And are the lessons actually the Conservatives could learn in dealing with reform today?
In some ways, Glenys's definition of the SDP was very accurate. She said they're trying to represent themselves as the Labour Party without the unions, but with the bomb. And that was a very apposite definition. And of course, they were a gift to the Tories because they divided the anti-non-conservative vote almost down the middle, especially after they'd allied with the Liberal Democrats. So this gave Thatcher a quite remarkable opportunity. What I've always said is a real war in the Falklands, the appearance of the beginnings of economic recovery, and the political war between the SDP and Labour gave her that gigantic majority in 1983. How did I deal with them? Well, first of all, by denouncing them, because I couldn't afford to be represented as in any sense SDP Mark II, but simultaneously seeking to jettison those parts of the Labour policy that really impeded the possibility of getting the breadth of support that we'd need to win an election. And I knew that was going to be a long slog. I used to speak of a 2-innings match. I didn't think that we could ever do it in one election. Of course, that was pretty obvious and right. And then as we gradually disgorged these policies that had been such an impediment, we began to see a real reduction in support of the Social Democrats. And eventually it ended up with them being defeated in the brutal by-election by Screaming Lord Sutch, at which point the SDP was finished.
They weren't defeated. They had fewer votes. They didn't win. Screaming Lord Sutch didn't win the by-election.
No, quite absolutely. They had less votes than David Sutch.
And Neil, what are the lessons, if you were Kemi Badenoch, dealing with the fact that you've got Tory MPs defecting to reform ahead of the Conservatives in the polls? What would be the lesson for her on how to deal with this new party, this new threat?
Well, she's got to take them on, denounce them in the way that I denounced the SDP, while adopting our form of the policy areas that really were acceptable to and could be sincerely embraced by Labour and were not emulating these policies set out and demanded by the Social Democrats. Now, the differences on the left of politics are more subtle than they would be on the right of politics, but nevertheless, that is the avenue that she has got to follow in order to try to restrain the slippage to reform and to restore the conventional, patriotic, Christian Democrat, welfare state supporting, market liking, small government demanding but never doing conservative party of your antecedent.
You're referring to Willie Whitelaw here.
That's what
my antecedent.
Exactly. I mean, there's Willie, Ted Heath, all the rest of it. The conservatives can succeed when they have no ideology. They have a presence, an organization, and they can attract the expectation of steadiness, dependability, reliability amongst the public, and still in office give the impression, sometimes under Thatcher genuine, otherwise not genuine, of being abreast of and slightly ahead of change. Now, when they do that, they're a formidable force. When they depart from it, well, we see what happened in 2024, and it would happen again. People from the SDP have long suggested that the changes I made were possible because of the pressures imposed by the existence of the Social Democratic Party. The opposite is true. They were a damn nuisance, because every shift that I argued for, every change that I made, drew the accusation of being SDP Mark II. And so that slowed the whole process of change. It meant that I had to argue on an additional front and not just on the straightforward merits or lack of them of a policy. And they really seriously got in the way of change. So instead of being the agency of change, they were an impediment.
Now, you became leader of the Labour Party in the wake of Michael Foot leading the party to a pretty catastrophic defeat in 1983. And I guess the early stages of your leadership were defined in many ways. I mentioned briefly earlier the battle with Militant, but there was also the miners' strike. Just take us through both of those in order, miners' strike, and then we'll come on to dealing with Militant. How hard was it for you to be seen to be, quotes, taking on or being very anti-Scargill? We all knew what you felt about Scargill. When in your blood was this sort of visceral belonging to mining as a community.
Arthur Scargill, the radical leader of the National Union of Miners, who was the great face of the miners' strike against Mrs. Thatcher in the 1980s, at the time when she was closing coal mines.
In a sense, it was in no way uncomfortable for me to be against Scargill because I was for the miners. If I put it into context, I never had much time for Scargill. I'd met him first in 1969 in the first National Miners' Conference that I went to.
And would you put him in that group that you were talking about earlier that believed in extra-parliamentary revolutionary change?
Yes, but he was more of a syndicalist. I'm sorry about another ism, Rory.
What's a syndicalist?
I'll tell you what a syndicalist is. Syndicalism developed in the mid-19th century in France under, I think, a man called Proudhon, who offered the idea that power grew and should grow from the point of production. So that consequently, the workers, Marx came to call the proletariat, could secure emancipation by the use or withdrawal of their labor. I'm simplifying things.
This is why the French call the unions les syndicats.
Which is what it boils down to. Or it's the other way around. The syndicalists are called syndicalists because of les syndicats. And that was adopted as a thesis by an element in the labor movement, especially in the wake of the First World War. It had existed beforehand, but in the wake of the First World War, when there was this buzzing, boiling confusion of isms in the wake of the revolution in Russia and all the rest of it, and indeed in Germany, and Rosa Luxemburg. Then in the midst of all that, there emerged in South Wales, it happens, a man called Noah Ablett, who was a brilliant speaker and a wonderful organizer, a coal miner, originally from the West Country, but from the Rhondda Valley, who secured dominance of the South Wales Miners' Federation and preached syndicalism, which seemed to be an entirely rational creed to a lot of people, because obviously the whole of the life of those industrial areas derived from coal mining, from production, and the sale of their output, which created massive fortunes on a Musk level, if you want a modern comparison. Anyway, Ablett was the leader of the South Wales Miners' Federation and the Miners' Federation of Great Britain, who got the TUC in 1926 to adopt a general strike, which lasted for 9 days in the transport and other industries, but lasted for, I think, 7 or 8 months in the coal mining industry.
And to fast forward, I'm being mean here, but Scargill is the heir of that tradition, the intellectual heir of that tradition.
Scargill embraced the ideas of Ablett, even though Ablett had, in the wake of the general strike, rejected his previous belief in syndicalism. By the 1960s, 70s, Scargill, and former member of the Young Communist League and a reluctant member of the Labour Party, as far as I'm concerned, was putting forward the idea, which he articulated during the strike, that by exercising their industrial power, the workers of this country could dislodge a government which was utterly opposed to them and establish a much better form of accountable democracy.
Just once more for listeners, quick summary of what Thatcher was doing with the mines, what Scargill was opposing, and the choice that you were faced with on trying to work out what position to take against Thatcher, what position to take against Scargill, what you felt the right policy was towards mining.
The resentments against the coal miners in the wake of the 1974 strike and election was monumental. Thatcher and others believed that there would one day be a reckoning, and there should be. And so by 1981, when Margaret Thatcher was the Prime Minister again, a very unpopular Prime Minister at the time, there was a strike, a pay strike, threatened in the coal mining industry, by which time Arthur Scargill had become president of the National Union of Mine Workers. And Thatcher was going to confront him, but eventually backed down because she realized she hadn't organized in anticipation of a national coal mining strike. And to everybody's astonishment and in delight in the coal fields, the miners won their paying claim and some other concessions and advantages in addition. In the wake of that experience in 81, Margaret Thatcher insisted on the building up of coal stocks, which by the spring of 1984 were 40% above their usual level. She secured changes in the law which denied the families of strikers any form of welfare benefits. She organized a national communication arrangement for the British police forces and secured the appointment of Ian McGregor to be chairman of the National Coal Board. In other words, she was prepared for a miners' strike. What she never anticipated, but must have delighted her, was the fact that the miners' strike started in March, with the summer coming not far behind. And most amazing of all, that the strike was undertaken without a pithead democratic ballot, which is unprecedented.
Who made your blood boil more at that time, Thatcher or Scargill?
Oh, I couldn't tell you. I mean, I've said, and I repeat, Scargill and Thatcher deserved each other. Nobody else did. I mean, they were both, in different ways entirely, ideologically committed to the idea of total victory. The difference being, one was a prepared conservative prime minister, and the other was a man who was willing to exploit the superhuman solidarity and loyalty of coal miners, especially young coal miners, who feared justifiably for their future.
Do you have any regrets about any of your handling of that time?
Yes, in the sense that while I'd made my position clear publicly and privately to Scargill and the NUM executive at the outset of the strike, that there had to be a ballot, because if there wasn't a ballot, the strike would lack legitimacy. It would be impossible to attract sympathetic action from other trade unions and workers, and the miners would be on the back foot politically because they had no democratic mandate. And the consequence would be a divided labour force.
And what are you saying? That you feel you didn't push for that hard enough, fight for that hard enough?
I should have said it at more regular intervals, more loudly, so that I would have reduced the possibility of misrepresentation. There would have been misrepresentation with the kind of media that we've got in any case, and it suited the conservative political interests, obviously, to misrepresent my position. But I should more forcibly have said this strike will not be successful, and worse, will end in disaster if it lacks legitimacy, which can only be gained with the ballot. The reason that I didn't say it more forcefully or with increasing publicity is that by the time we were in the third and fourth month of the strike, and several of the coalfields, particularly South Wales, had endured a loss of wages as a result of the work to rule before the strike started, and then the strike itself, and the deprivation of communities and families, what I didn't want to do was to give any impression that I wasn't supporting their cause, the case for coal, which was Britain's main energy source at the time, preponderant energy source, and had a serious economic argument to support it. I didn't want to give the impression that I was flagging in my support for their cause, and thereby, apart from demoralizing them, which would have been terrible, to allow Scargill the opportunity to claim that they were only not winning because of my lack of endeavour.
Let's just go back to that militant speech in 1985. As you know, I'm a great lover and student of oratory, and I think it was one of the finest oratorical moments of the last century, frankly.
And you remind us what you said. I'd love to be reminded. Can you remember that the great lines of that speech?
There are people who can recite the whole speech,
Yeah,
or at least that part of it.
what was it?
I can't.
What was? But when you woke up that morning, and I've worked with you on speeches, you're a complete nightmare because you got the red pen out until the very, very end of the process. You basically write all your own speeches. But did you know when you woke up that morning, you were going to say the things that you said in the way that you said them and with the effect that they had?
I didn't wake up that morning because I hadn't been to bed, which was my appalling habit the night before the leader's speech in conference, for a variety of reasons, none of them really good ones. I didn't start to write those speeches until at least 10:30 on the Monday night before the Tuesday performance, which was stupid, but there we are. So I woke up on Monday morning, as it were, as I had on several previous mornings, determined to make that speech, or that part of the speech. And so I had no doubt at all about it. I hadn't rehearsed the phrases in my mind or anything, but I knew that I was going to use a relatively recent development of them sending out redundancy notices by taxi because they couldn't get the unionized council workforce to distribute the redundancy notices. I was going to use that as an illustration of their malignancy and their incompetence. I knew I was going to say that, but not in the precise syntax that I offered.
And did you know it was going to have the kind of impact that it did, both in terms of the moment of some of your critics storming out in a sort of self-indulgent way, Derek Hatton responding the way that he did. But above all, I think the longer term impact, which means that we can still talk about it so many years later with quite a lot of our listeners absolutely clear what we're talking about.
They were going to get it whether they liked it or not.
But it could have gone wrong for you.
Oh, it could have, easily. I mean, what I couldn't have dreamt of was that reaction that you referred to of Hatton getting up and shouting at the platform and Eric Heffer walking out, which gave a dramatization that made the occasion even more memorable. I couldn't have dreamt of that. And I was just very fortunate that that was their reaction. I mean, I was provoking them into a fight, which I was looking forward to. Because the thing that I realized, which very few other people did, was that whatever I said on that day, if we were going to, quote, quote, take on militant, then we were going to have to follow up the speech with a knockdown, drag-out process of evidence gathering and prosecution.
Which went on for a long time.
Oh, it did. Months, 8 months altogether, I think, and hundreds of hours. And it drove me nuts and it distracted everybody. And it was a reminder all the time of the division in the party. But it had to be done. And I would have done it the year before, but I couldn't do it in the middle of the miners' strike. I mean, if I was lucky, it wouldn't have been heard. And if I was unlucky, which I would have been, it would have been morally destructive, or destructive of morale, which is slightly different. But they were going to get it on that morning or that afternoon in 1985 anyway.
I can feel Rory gagging to relive the moment.
So the speech that we remember goes, I'll tell you what happens with impossible promises.
You start with far-fetched resolutions. They are then pickled into a rigid dogma, a code. And you go through the years sticking to that, outdated, misplaced, irrelevant to the real needs, and you end in the grotesque chaos of a Labour council hiring taxis to scuttle around a city, handing out redundancy notices
to its own workers. No, up we go, up we go, up we go.
I mean, the phrase in that told the story really irrelevant to the real needs. Irrelevant to the real needs. That is, in my view, that's the cardinal sin. That's the Labour movement, the Labour Party, democratic socialists have always got to be relevant.
Neil, one of the challenges then as you go forward, as you're now the leader of the Labour Party, you've taken over from Michael Foot. He's gone into 1983 with what most listeners will remember as the longest suicide note in history. A developing perception amongst bits of the British public is that Labour had gone too left-wing under Foot. And you're beginning to sense as you go into 1987 that Labour needs to move more to the centre ground, win back those centre voters, and that some of the policies which are really angering the Labour left, one example of that will be Thatcher's attack on the unions, but another eventually becomes sales of council houses, are in fact actually quite popular with Middle Britain. So you then are faced with a real problem, right? Which is that the idealistic, ideological left of the Labour Party wants to remain very purist. And actually, even today, I noticed when I was an MP in 2015, I remember going into an election and people saying, do you want to ride police horses into the face of the working man? Are you going to sell off council houses? This stuff becomes kind of mythical. But you're having to deal with the fact that you sense that the centre ground British politics and middle ground voters are actually in favour of things like the sale of council houses. How do you deal with that as a leader?
I think I can best answer your question by focusing on one of the things that you refer to, sale of council houses. Now, I was brought up in a council house. My family were very, very, very relieved to move out of the appallingly bad terraced house that we had and into this centrally heated, fully equipped, indoor toilet and bathroom, all mod cons in the kitchen, prefabricated house. Wonderful. It was a council house. And my parents lived there for 17 years altogether. And there were elements in the Labour Party who were resistant to any sale of council houses. I was actually in favour of it because I did comprehend that people who'd spent generations in a house were very resentful at the idea that when the parents died and the tenancy was relinquished, there was nothing left, not simply in terms of monetary gain, but in terms of the home being disposed of by powers beyond their control. And I comprehended that. And what I most opposed in the Thatcher proposal was the way in which she prohibited by law the use of the revenue from the sale of council houses for new build and refurbishment, which I thought was utter madness. 63 billion it eventually amounted to, that simply was at the disposal of the Treasury and not at the disposal of the local councils. It's a major cause of the social housing rental crisis we've got in the country now, these decades later. Now, in the party, there'd always been councils that sold council houses and derived success from them because they used the resources for new build and development and improvement and so on. But the element in the party that resisted any form of sale, led by Tony Benn, was an area of policy and people that I knew had to be overturned. And I set it as a primary objective when I was elected leader. And I can recount, in order to illustrate exactly what occurred. We got to the home policy meeting where a paper prepared by Jeff Rooker, now Lord Rooker and a dear friend and comrade, I'd made the housing spokesman, showed how the Labour Party could adopt a comprehensive policy for the sale of council houses and the renewal of housing stock. Wonderful. When we got to the meeting, the only way I could derive a majority in that meeting was if one of my two great trade union mates on that committee, one went out for a smoke and the other one went to the toilet. And because they weren't there, I got a majority of one. They repeated the performance at the National Executive Committee, and it was made a policy recommendation for the conference. Now, I'm gone into that detail in order to describe to you the sociology, if you like, of the Labour Party decision-making process at that time. In the course of the argument in the Home Policy Committee, Tony Benn intervened to say that these are not our houses to dispose of. These are the houses of the community. And that provoked me into intervening myself. I'd taken an oath not to intervene, just to get the vote, get it over with, let the boys go to the lavatory and go out.
You're not going to tell me
smoke.
temper got the best of your deal.
But I burst at that and I said, Tony, you've never paid a rent or a mortgage in your life.
This is class warfare.
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely. And I gave him a proletarian lecture on the huge advantage of council housing and ownership, which I'd enjoyed since the day after I got married. And he was flabbergasted.
And presumably this was an infuriating thing for Benn because it was always a great weakness that people could accuse him of being an aristocrat.
And he was such a good guy. He was a nice man that he was really upset by my tirade. Anyway, we got a majority of one. The policy was changed. And that was an alteration in the center of gravity of the Labour Party. But that left Europe, the bomb, trade union legislation, nationalization, and a few other things to be also changed. But I wasn't pursuing the center ground. I was trying to dispose of policy packages that were seriously and obviously impeding the Labour Party and any possibility of advance. And I just thought that, and I made the argument, that if you want the Labour Party to be doing good things, to be doing socialist things, we've got to get rid of these impediments so that we can get the power to do good. And eventually, of course, that's the argument that won.
I'm going to give you two names and ask you for your reaction, your top of head thoughts about both. Thatcher Murdoch.
It's going to be difficult for me to accomplish all that without offending against all the codes of broadcast decency. Margaret Thatcher was sincere, which is half the problem. I've always thought, and I might be an exception in this thought, but I've always thought trying to lift a chip off her shoulder. I think that Margaret Thatcher really did suffer from underperforming bourgeois syndrome, that she had been brought up in a household dominated utterly by her father, who was a strict nonconformist, chapel-going, conservative alderman, conservative in instinct, in personality, in his bone marrow, not just in his politics. And he managed to implant in Margaret Thatcher a view of herself and society, of the world, that produced a particular kind of politics.
And what was that kind of politics?
Well, of the established order in her perception, in black and white, never in technicolor, was satisfactory but under threat because of malignant forces like trade unions, uppity colonial leaders, communists, obviously, and that the United States and the monarchy, the aristocracy, the structure of British society offered the best hope of overcoming these dreadful threats.
Can I come in on this? Because sometimes she actually sounded as though she didn't really like the aristocracy, didn't really like the old establishment.
That she hated deferring to them, but she did. Now, I'm going to exaggerate a small instance. In Buckingham Palace, you could see courtiers and others smiling when they observed Margaret Thatcher curtsying to the Queen. It was a gymnastic performance. It was quite extraordinary. And not just to myself and Glenys. We never curtsied or bowed, and the Queen didn't give a damn. It didn't bother her at all. And it didn't bother anybody else in the royal family as far as I could ever see. But Mrs. Thatcher, Margaret Thatcher, Lady Thatcher, used to go through this extraordinary knee-bending Hollywood performance, which was amazing. And it indicated a form of extraordinary, unasked for, certainly by Queen Elizabeth, and certainly by Charles or any of the others, unasked for deference. So there was this peculiar duality of her deference and respect for supreme aristocracy and irritation, almost disgust for the way in which privileged had managed to secure advantaged conditions for people who didn't have her capacities.
So one of the things that always interests me about her is that people portray her as a sort of defender of the establishment, but in fact, she was sort of often very angry and contemptuous of civil service mandarins, of foreign office diplomats, of ambassadors, a lot of the old structures of the British establishment. She really wanted to blow up. She was quite revolutionary in a way.
Which is one of her great natural talents, was to not to have to adopt the mindset or attitudes of what you could call the small rentier class, the local business people who derived their livings from the neighborhood, served the community in a variety of ways, but enjoyed the unwritten power that they could exert in that area. I mean, there are any number of playwrights of the last 100 years who've expressed that much better than I could. But Margaret Thatcher was authentically from that. And it was a credit to her that she traveled as far and as quickly as she did. There's no question at all about that. And to become the first woman Prime Minister and woman leader of the Conservative Party was an extraordinary accomplishment. Now, it involved a series of accidents, but she was there and she did seize the day. There's no question at all about that. The effect of her embracing, at the instigation of Keith Joseph, the economics of Milton Friedman, of monetarism, and of mixing that in with her general ideological outlook, proved to be and has proved to be utterly disastrous for our country.
Is there anything she did that you can point to and say that was good for the long-term benefit of the United Kingdom?
I can't really think of it. Maybe, but it didn't work out in the long term. The support that she gave to the establishment of the single market of what was then the European Community, the fact that she chose as a commissioner a man who would unobtrusively but forcefully, if that's not a confusion in terms, persuade the Commission and secure the agreement of the member states to that quite gigantic evolution of the community, that worked to the benefit of Europe and particularly the United Kingdom. But of course, it's been utterly destroyed by departure from the European Union.
But Neil, there were some things that her government did which you became, I suppose, comfortable with some version of. I mean, compared to the 1970s, by the time you're running in 1992, she's brought taxes down from a very high level at the top of the 1970s. There's been privatization. You weren't in favor of returning to 1970s taxation or 1970s nationalization, so you'd accepted some of her settlement, right?
Yes, but to be not in favor of the restoration of Morrisonian nationalization and to be in favor of the form of privatization that Margaret Thatcher introduced are two entirely different things. Privatization has been, in terms of prices, consumer service, accountability, misuse of resources, catastrophic. And it's most clearly illustrated, of course, by the condition of the water and sewage industry, and it's manifested also in the railways. And whatever you wanted to do with privatization generally, I think there would be pretty substantial majority agreement.
And deregulation and low taxes?
Yes, deregulation, fine, where the regulations are an impediment to investment, to genuine entrepreneurship, to innovation, to competition. But where you're simply removing the impediments to exploitation and excess, that's a different thing altogether.
So you're a bit more left-wing than Blair. You're sounding more left-wing than Blair.
Well, I don't know what the left-right spectrum really means in this. The question that Tony addressed quite rightly, that I addressed many years before that, is, does it work? I used to say, does it bloody well work? But nevertheless, the implication is entirely the same. So I'm not abandoning any form of belief, ideology, analysis, any stuff like that. But I don't think it helps a hell of a lot, because the fundamental question is, does it work? If it doesn't, don't do it. If it does, continue or innovate. I mean, that's a basic rule. No, it's a rule that Margaret Thatcher might have asked herself to obey at various times, but she abandoned in her enthusiasm, unremitting and unconditional, for monetarism. And of course, the application of that with the rapidity and absolutism that occurred through Geoffrey Howe as Chancellor of the Exchequer from 1979 eradicated 25% of British manufacturing capacity in 3 or 4 years. Now, it was underinvested. It didn't have the productivity that should have been achieved, comparable to Germany, to parts of France, to the Nordic countries, to the USA. Okay, so the weak were driven further down and out of business. But it was all done without any preparation or any compensation. And it means that all these decades later, we have huge areas of our country who feel abandoned, who are culturally and socially destroyed because of the rapid and uncompromising removal of their sustenance and indeed the source of their identity. Now, when all that occurs, and it occurs as the result of the blunt application of unrehearsed policy without preparation, then it's destructive of I'll use the term, the soul of the country. And a great deal of what we confront now, to the disadvantage of our younger generations, which is what really matters, is deriving from that completely irresponsible application of ideology, which was misplaced and indeed unproductive.
But just to go to the point that Rory was making about, so when we came in and Tony was in charge and Gordon was Chancellor, and you and I have had many, many, many private conversations about that period and during that period, and you've always been wonderfully loyal. But where, I guess the point Rory's making is you did try to move Labour Party to the centre.
Yeah, if you want to use that geographic expression.
Well, I do.
Okay,
people understand it.
I don't mind you doing it. I just hope that it's not misleading.
No, but
the idea that there's this magical, difficult to define thing called the centre.
No, okay, but let's just accept, for the sake of this argument, that you moved the Labour Party and then Tony moved it further. Right. I guess what Rory's asking is whether there were times when you felt that we were moving too far, and I guess, given we're talking about Thatcher here, whether you felt we accepted too much of the Thatcher settlement and should have reversed more of it.
If I were interviewing Tony Blair, I wouldn't have got quite such a passionate speech as I just got out of you. I think he was more accepting of some of the market mechanisms than you were. So it'd be interesting to talk about that a bit, if you felt you could do so without being disloyal.
Yeah. The problem is, it wasn't the market, but a failure by some people to recognize the market only works effectively to the general benefit of the capitalist system and the people if it's regulated. If you have an unregulated, or you radically reduce the regulation of the market, things go wrong. And if you don't believe me, remember 2007, 2008.
So did we?
And the greatest crash in economic history.
So did we accept? So my question: Did we accept too much?
No, I put it slightly differently, because you've got the point. It is that there wasn't enough effort dedicated to tearing up the roots of the malign effects of Thatcherism. I understand why. I understand that the current was flowing in a particular direction, that there was an established order of affairs. The economy wasn't faring too badly, growth rate of 2.4, 2.5%, which would be miraculous now, but was conventional then. And all those things going on, the Tories rejected finally after 18 years. And the fact that New Labour was so manifestly, graphically different, was enough to carry us forward and to achieve great things. No question about what Tony and Gordon achieved in terms of investment in health, education, combating pensioner poverty, Sure Start. I had my arguments. Well, they weren't arguments, they were discussions with both of them about the private finance initiative, which I was critical of when it was introduced in a slightly different form under John Major, and I think hadn't changed. And I actually thought the market was willing to provide resources for public sector investment without the kind of conditions that were allowed by Major and then by Tony and Gordon. But nevertheless, with those reservations, I celebrated all the time certainly in terms of domestic policy, what New Labour did. But what they didn't do was to say Thatcherism implanted serious weaknesses in our economy, in our society, which will cost our country dear as the time goes on.
It's a very difficult question, but what do you think could have been done between 97 and 2008 to avoid some of the problems that we had later?
For instance, a radical house program of house building, still continuing to sell council houses to sitting tenants. I haven't got any problem with that. But a real focus on the development of the physical infrastructure, especially housing. That could and should have been done. And I would have liked, as I suggest, to make changes to the to PFI.
Would you have nationalised the water industry?
Yes. But the way I would have done it, at really much reduced cost, is to convert the massive subsidies, still naturally having to be paid to the water and sewage industry, into share purchases. So that very gradually, the government could have established a share of over 29% in those industries and re-regulated them. Now, the other thing is there would have been the modernization of some regulation of the financial sector without diminishing the strength of the City of London at all. In fact, I think that it might have been probable, I'm not an expert in this area by any means, but I think it would have been possible to have used the effective regulation and self-regulation of the city as a way of promoting further strength for the British financial system.
Murdoch.
Yes. Well, my hostility to him is unremitting. I doubt if that is going to cause him the loss of 1 second of sleep, which I regret. This man, since he was young, follows the money and can see no other objective in life, except that he came to understand very early on that the ownership of newspapers, of communication media, automatically carried with it a degree of power, of influence, which could be useful and had to be used in furtherance of business interests. Now, of course, that made him opportunistic, which is not unusual, and in some cases not particularly objectionable. But as his power and influence grew, it became very self-centered, almost imperialist.
And how powerful were the Murdoch papers? Was it necessary for Alastair and Tony to go out and see Murdoch to get their blessing?
As you may recall, Alastair, I was, I put it very moderately, slightly displeased by the idea that you are going to pay court, as I think I put it at the time, to that bastard, as I think I put it at the time.
You didn't need to hold a kettle filled with boiling water.
That wasn't
inches
deliberate.
of my
that
face.
That wasn't deliberate. That was coincidental.
Can you talk us through this moment, Alison?
I was making a cup of tea, for God's sake.
Give us your
making
version.
a cup of tea while venting about the fact that we traipsed halfway around the fucking world to see that. I won't say the next word. Have you ever had your head stuck inside a fucking light bulb, etc.? And the kettle that he was genuinely boiling to make a cup of tea, getting ever closer to my face. But we survived this.
So you think actually they didn't need to do that?
But you sort of, you talked about sometimes when you have to do political things and what have you. So what I was partly driven by having watched what the Murdoch press did to you. And I was determined that wasn't going to happen to Tony.
And as the days and weeks passed, I have to say, despite my initial fury, which because they were my friends, I was in the fortunate position of being able to tell them straight between the eyes how I felt. which didn't come as any surprise to them. I realized that part of their reasoning was because they'd witnessed what the Murdoch press had tried to do to me, and that they were going to try and at least neutralize that. And secondly, that this thesis that they put forward, that if we can't get them on side, we can try to blunt them by personal contact, I thought had common sense to it. So eventually I came to terms with it. I did say, and Alastair may remember this, that he will betray you. And of course, eventually he did, but not for a very long time. And I must say that the neutrality and then support of the Murdoch media, well, I don't know how useful it was, but it certainly was better than having their antagonism in political terms, even though it was deeply offensive, of course, to sections of the Labour electorate, particularly those in Merseyside.
So there was this amazing moment, 87 to 92, where it looks like you're going to turn around the Labour Party and you're going to win. In fact, the polls going into that election in 92 look like you're going to win. What was the strategy? Imagine we're in 1991, you're giving a speech to the core of the Labour Party. What is the strategy that you thought would to win that election? How are you going to win that election?
Well, this difficulty. And the difficulty started on the day that John Major became leader of the Conservative Party. I said on the night that Thatcher resigned to my people in the office, it was quite crowded, drink and be merry tonight, because tomorrow we have got an entirely different battle. Now, I was anticipating the election of Michael Heseltine, which I was looking forward to, because despite his talents, which are very substantial, he was in the Conservative Party a very divisive figure. And I thought we could take advantage of that. When John Major became the leader, without actually being elected, it therefore presented us with a terrible problem, because we didn't know and we never really decided. I don't think we give enough thought to it, which is a shame, whether to represent him as the offspring of Thatcher and Thatcher in trousers, or to represent him as someone who'd been adopted and accepted simply because he contrasted with her wretchedness. And we never really made up our minds which to do.
And
now,
in
here was this
retrospect, what do you think was the better strategy? What should you have done?
Neither of those. We should have really understood what a decent, competent guy he was, and simply gone after him because of the policies he espoused and supported, and the way in which he...
So that is son of Thatcher?
Yes, that is kind of son of Thatcher, but unquestioning supporter of Thatcher, who'd opportunistically seized the crown and should be attacked as a typical politician, having, and the phrase I was going to use, rather shamefacedly got rid of the poll tax, which was the source of so much of the Tory ailment. Now, that at least would have been cogent.
I do think something fascinating here. You both ran against Major, and I'd really like to get the contrast of these approaches. So we've heard a little bit about you 92. What was your analysis in 97 on how you should fight Major, and how did that differ from the way that Neil had fought him? You were fighting the same man.
People knew who he was by 97.
But so
they had no idea who John Major was in 92.
But tell us about the 97 analysis and how you thought you could beat him and how it would be different to the way the 92 campaign was run.
Well, I think partly we were more able to make it much, much more about us.
Yes.
Whereas I think Thatcher and Thatcherism was still the dominant factor in the debate. And I also think that, I'd really be interested in Neil's take on this, John Smith, who was Shadow Chancellor and was seen as very safe and solid and what have you, but the shadow budget, I don't know what your view is, Labour presented a shadow budget, which I think opened the door to the Tories to mount a very, very conventional anti-Labour attack. It was putting up tax to pay for different things. And I just think that against Thatcher, that might have worked. I think by then Major had managed to present himself as a very different sort of political figure. He had some really good attack dogs behind him.
Chris Patton
Chris
especially.
Patton in particular. And they absolutely, once the shadow budget was out, I mean, I remember in the day saying, I am now really worried. So I think we maybe neutralised the Tories better. Is that fair?
Yes. And as I said, the Tories under John Major were divided, but he was better known. And it was at the end of 18 years. Now, in 92, I mean, Alastair's right about the shadow budget. I'd argued from October, November of 91 that we should begin to disclose the main elements of our fiscal policy in order that we would maximize the time available for rebuttal, explanation, to try and win the argument over the common sense, economic soundness, and justice of the main proposals we had, which related, for instance, as Alastair said, to combating child poverty and pension poverty, which was widespread and was fundamental and a serious, desperate problem for millions in the country. And we had policies that, without imposing excessive taxation, in fact, without making any difference at all to the overwhelming majority of the population, could provide us with the resources to deal with these priorities. And I wanted months to impart all that. John insisted, a highly respected figure of considerable brilliance in many, many ways, insisted that his concept of the shadow budget produced the day after the real budget as a rebuttal was the way to do it. And he adopted that attitude the moment it became apparent in early October of 1991 that there wasn't going to be an election until the spring. And I couldn't afford to even have a private quarrel with John over that because he would have been public within seconds. I simply couldn't afford to allow the idea of a serious division between the Shadow Chancellor and the leader of the party to arise. So I kept my counsel and we went ahead with the shadow budget, which then gave us days, weeks for attempted rebuttal and explanation instead of the months that I wanted.
So Neil, this is critical then.
Yeah.
So that if we were creating a sort of drama out of this,
Yeah.
this is the moment where you lose the election. In retrospect, what could you have done to head off John Smith? Should you have asserted your authority more? Why couldn't you trust him not to keep that disagreement private? Why couldn't you grip it and
well,
follow
I could
your
have trusted
judgment?
John to keep it private, but I couldn't really contemplate the possibility that he wouldn't talk to his staff.
And it was kind of in the ether anyway.
Yeah,
It was in the ether.
Yeah, well, it was in the ether.
But
well,
in
I give an
retrospect,
instance.
wouldn't it have been better just to assert your authority, say, we're putting it out now?
No, that
here's
would
the
have meant
budget.
sacking him, which would have been disastrous.
So he lost you the election in some ways.
I'd never say that. I'd never say that. I wouldn't even say that this issue relating to the shadow budget was the single cause. I mean, I was part of the cause of us losing. The recency of the great change we'd made and the allegation, which I knew was coming from the Tories, that our changes were opportunistic and cosmetic because we'd made them only in order to gain some votes for the election. And we were insincere. And however admirable the changes were, they demonstrated our agreement with the Tories and not any independent change, all that stuff.
And that particularly in the context of the way that the defence policy had sort of evolved and changed over time.
Tell us about that defence
Well,
policy.
it's just to move from being a unilateral nuclear disarming party to a completely different position.
Yes.
It wasn't just one thing, but I think that was the moment I felt this election was going, and I felt Neil felt that. I remember talking to Glenys at the time.
But you had another alternative, which was to go into the election saying there will be no tax rises at all. We're going to copy the Tories' fiscal policy letter for letter.
Well, in the conditions of 1991-92, that wouldn't have been feasible. By the time they got to 96, 97, and Gordon Brown gave that undertaking, he could do it.
Why couldn't you do it in 91?
My argument with Gordon at the time was, it's great, do it for 1 year. Don't do it for 2 years. I thought 2 years was
Why couldn't you do
much.
it? Why couldn't you do it in 91, 92? Because that again is Keir Starmer's strategy, wasn't it? He went into an election essentially saying he wasn't going to raise taxes.
Sure, because it had been successfully performed in 96, 97. And I don't blame Keir for doing much the same thing. It's unfortunately painted the Labour government into a corner. But nevertheless, in lead up to an election, I don't blame him at all for adopting that strategy. It wasn't really obvious to us in 91, 92 because the serious central policies of combating pensioner poverty, for instance, that we were committed to could not have been feasible without change in taxation, specifically taking the cap off the national insurance contributions so that people did continue to pay proportionate national insurance contributions after £22,500, which was the cap amount set in the period before 92. So we couldn't simultaneously undertake to address a major problem for the whole country of pensioner poverty and say that we weren't going to raise taxes. It would have been stupid to even try.
The 1992 election, even though in your bones you might, the campaign went on, thought this is not going to happen, and I certainly felt that towards the end, it was nonetheless devastating. And I remember I covered the campaign with you. I was with you on election night. I was with you the next day. And then we went away on holiday for a while as well. I just want, I know you get through it, but do you ever actually get over something quite as crushing as that?
I think I did, partly because of, obviously, Glenys and the kids, and you and Fiona, and other members of my family, Colin and Barbara, my brother-in-law and sister-in-law, and that very tight surrounding circle of friends and comrades. Also the huge flow of affection from the Labour movement. John Major said to me, he was kind enough to ask me to lunch the week after I stopped being leader in July 92. And he said to me, how's the party treating you? I said, with huge generosity. Some of them, in mistaken kindness, have even asked me to stay on. God help me. And he said, oh, it's different from my party. I would be crucified if I'd lost. And I said, well, okay, perhaps the Labour Party is more used to losing and has affection for its vanquished. But all that, the main thing that meant that I didn't wear the scars was my preoccupation with what was going to happen to the people who'd given me their lives in my office for the previous 9 years. Most of them for 9 years, all of them for more than 5 years. And I was so concerned about what was going to happen to them and trying to ensure that they prospered and had good futures, which they did. Mm-hmm. I'm very, very happy to say, largely by dint of their own remarkable talents. But they've thrived, all of them, which is great. But I was so preoccupied with that I couldn't really focus on having been beaten. There's also, I will confess, as I have on previous occasions, there was a relief at not carrying that every second of every day for all those years. The weight was mitigated massively by Glenys and the family and friends like you. But it was always there, and it had gone. Oh God, what a relief.
But then I think the other thing is interesting listening to you. I don't know what Roy thinks of this, but you get the sense you can't really bring yourself to be remotely warm about Thatcher, but you actually are very warm about John Major.
Relatively, yes.
And of course, John. Another night we were with you is when John Major phoned you up and offered you this.
Yes.
To become a European Commissioner. Was that? I know you talked about it and thought about it, but that was quite a big thing for him to do, I
It
think.
was. He was in favour, it appears, of me going when the commission changed in 92. And the Delors Commission had 2 years added to its tenure because of the way in which the new admissions to the European Union were coming and other changes being made. So the extra 2 years was stuck on. Our commissioner, Bruce
Milan, yeah.
Bruce Milan, wanted to leave the commission and wanted me to succeed him. So he let that be known. And apparently John Major agreed with him. But the cabinet didn't. And it didn't on the understandable grounds that they'd been saying for years I couldn't run a work stall. So how were they going to support me being a United Kingdom commissioner on the European Commission? And it was comprehensible to me.
Yeah.
I didn't know whether the chance had gone forever. But when eventually the commission term was ending, John Major did phone me. You happened to be there on that day. I'd just come back from Manchester where I'd been interviewing
Ryan Giggs
for
the
Evening
Evening Standard.
Yes. So it was quite a day in many ways. And of course for celebration. But the thing is about John Major is he's a decent cove from a background which doesn't compare with mine, which was much more disadvantaged than mine. I mean, mine wasn't disadvantaged.
He would have been much stronger contender in the Angela Rayner, Bridget Phillipson off that you talked about in episode 1, Rory.
I mean, and in his case, it would have been true.
Now, Neil, just to return for a second to that loss. I mean, what strikes me listening to you is the burden that you were carrying from 83 to 92 was that you didn't just feel that you were trying to win a game. You were fighting for something that was existential.
Yes.
I mean, Thatcherism for you was you were carrying the burden. You've just described how much damage the Conservatives had done. So winning in 87 and 92 was not just a question of personal vanity, and this was your life's meaning. So it must have felt unbelievably devastating. It wasn't just a personal loss. It was a massive loss in everything you believed in, what you believed in terms of British public, what you believed in terms of British nation, what you believed in terms of decency and politics.
Yes. And the most important part was, you just mentioned it, the condition of the country and the prospects for the country, which I felt had been hugely damaged, maybe irretrievably, unless the ism of Margaret Thatcher was contradicted and uprooted. I thought that John Major was likely to mitigate it, but not do any better than that. And thus it is proved. And the Labour government, 13 years of Labour government, did seriously mitigate the damage, but the residue is still there. And it's evident in our low productivity, in our separation from the rest of our continent, in social and public attitudes, in the housing crisis, in the condition of the financial sector, in privatization. It's still there, decades later.
So given all that, how could you explain to yourself why people in 92 would vote again for the Conservatives, given all that you'd seen, given all the damage that you felt they'd inflicted, given your sense of British voters? I mean, it must have been very, very difficult to understand how they could vote again for the Tories after 13 years, given all that.
One reason was that Margaret Thatcher had gone, and the other reason was that I hadn't gone. The fact that Margaret Thatcher had gone meant that the change that the public overwhelmingly, as the polls showed, were demanding had occurred. And in her wake came this almost unknown, mild-mannered, normal guy from a disadvantaged background who'd made his way right up through politics and had a reassuring presence. And so that was a very substantial reason. The other reason was I'd been there far too long. I, to the public, was stale. I was same old, same old. And so consequently, whatever policies we were offering, there was no additional offer, no extra 5% coming from Kinnock, because I really do believe that shelf life has huge significance in democratic politics. And I'd probably outlived my shelf life.
So can I just say, in Neil's defence, there's also another factor which actually Alastair McAlpine, you would know, and he was a former bigwig in the Conservative Party.
Tory party treasurer.
Tory treasurer. And he said to the party staff and publicly, let's not pretend this was us winning this. The real heroes of our campaign were David English, the editor of the Daily Mail, Nicholas Lloyd, the editor of the Daily Express, Kelvin Mackenzie, editor of The Sun. I mean, they absolutely weaponized the press. And I don't know whether it made that big a difference, but it's to have years of relentless, negative, non-stop coverage, you pay a price for that, which, to go back to our earlier discussion, is why we were so determined to try to neutralise them. Now, I know you'll be loyal because you always are, but we haven't even got on to Labour today. It's quite a frustrating watch at the moment.
Frustration is the word, because we've got this huge majority that is biscuit thin, 50 miles wide and 1 inch deep. I know that. The public knows that. Keir Starmer knows that. But we've still got the legitimate authority of being the government of the United Kingdom, elected across the whole of the country. I'm frustrated by the fact that that justifiable means of making change is not being fully used. I don't mean an authoritarian way or any bullying way. I mean with the maximum of consultation and consideration. But nevertheless, there's such a yearning for change in the country, which paradoxically, of course, partly explains the support for populism. That it isn't a support for the dishonesty and misrepresentation, the mirages of Farage. It's a yearning for an alteration in what is felt to be a real deterioration in standards of living, of conduct, of world significance, all kinds of things.
Do you think there's something that has changed fundamentally between your time and the time that I was working with Tony and now that makes it much, much harder to do that?
Yes.
I think that there must be something that we're missing, because you and I probably agree on a lot of the things that need to be done. And I think that they, in number 10, think they need to be done. But there's something different about our politics now that is harder to do. Is that?
It's the way in which any instinct for audacity has been discouraged, almost prohibited.
But Trump is showing the opposite.
Well, of course, Thatcher did. Tony did. Not because you want an adventurist like Trump, who's a menace to the whole world, but because you want from democracy to show a perpetual freshness. Montesquieu, who was French Prime Minister back in the 50s, a significant socialist figure, said that democracy is like a bicycle, comme un bicyclette, that it must go forward to stay upright. And that's the constant requirement of democracy. Now, anything that looks that it's slowed down to a halt, that it hasn't got fresh initiatives to deal with perpetual change, which is, as the name suggests, always occurring in any case, generates at best disappointment, disillusionment, the feeling that the powerlessness of the government in these circumstances is a reflection of the impotence that people feel themselves to cope with the constant changes.
Can you see a way of this being turned around, of Farage being stopped, of Labour getting another majority next time?
we require, I think, probably three things. One over which we haven't got any real control, but the things over which we have control are accomplishment, the demonstration in practical terms that things are starting to work, that improvements are being secured, that advances are being made. Now, to some extent, of course, that always in any case takes time, especially with a government that absolutely rightly has made record commitments to the improvement, modernization of public investment, which in turn will magnetize private investment, which is great. But by definition, there are no instantaneous advances that come with that. But other achievements, and the government has got a wholly inadequate communication system because it's not even telling the people the good things that are very gradually, painstakingly being achieved. And on top of the inadequacy in communications, many of the good things are obscured by the distractions and the mistakes that have been made, which every government makes. But they've completely clouded and made invisible some of the good things that are happening. Now, achievement is the irreplaceable requirement. If we don't succeed, we won't get support. Full stop. That's it. Second thing, we ought to be much more effective in our exposure of Farage and populism and reform, who they associate with, what they do, what they really think, what they've promised, the pledges that they've broken, discarded without a second thought. All that must be exposed and reported again and again and again and again, simply so that people understand the massive confidence trick that is being successfully attempted so far. Now, there's nothing that illustrates that better than the stance of the Reform people in the period before the 2016 referendum vote. And it isn't that I'm bemoaning, it's the reality. They told what they knew or they must have known to be lies about immigration, about the economic prospects beyond our departure from the single market.
Well, they denied it would leave the single market.
Well, of course, they said in explicit terms that it would be supreme folly to leave the single market. And yet they knew, they must have known, it was the absolutely unavoidable consequence of leaving the European Union, of voting to leave. The third thing that we should attempt to do, without bullying or any form of oppressive behavior whatsoever, on the contrary, is to improve our communication, especially social media, radically, transformationally, because we are losing the air war. I suppose the last thing, this is four things now, that we should try to do is to get the mainstream media to treat Reform and Farage like a normal, professional political party, instead of treating them as a novelty, which is the source of easy stories.
Okay, final thing from me. What would Prime Minister Kinnock be doing dealing with the challenge posed by Trump and Trumpism at the moment? And what would you be doing about
I'd be
Britain's
trying to
relationship with
take
the European
advantage
Union?
of him. I mean, I admire hugely the patience, the tolerance being shown by Keir Starmer towards Trump. He hasn't really got an alternative because of the capricious attitude that Trump's got and the way in which he would, without question, conduct the most vicious form of vendetta. He's capable of doing that. And Keir Starmer can't afford to gamble and won't gamble ever with the fortunes of our country and make us the object of malevolence by Donald Trump. But I would try to take advantage of Trump. For instance, and it's not too late now, last April, Trump's so-called Independence Day, which was an act of madness in completely seeking to destroy the consensus, which since 1945 gave us 30 of the best years that the world economy or our economy or the American economy ever achieved. That's the 30 years after the war. And has been corroded since, but still exists. Trump is smashing it to smithereens with potentially appalling consequences. Now, I would have tried last April to say, look, what the President of the United States has said and is doing, which is perfectly entitled to do, means that the arithmetic and the expectations of last July have been shredded. We therefore have to adopt a different course, which means intensifying and accelerating our efforts to make a new relationship with the European Union. It means we have to change our fiscal stance and start to make a proper levy on assets while not inflicting additional charges on people who have to work for their living, taking advantage of the crisis inflicted by Trump in order to make changes. And I would still be seeking to do that because I think people in general recognize, certainly leaderships of various countries do, that Trump is making such changes without warning and without a second thought, frankly, that it alters the whole basis on which government policies have been anticipated, developed, applied. And therefore, change is essential in order to sustain prosperity and security, which are the fundamental requirements of democratic governments.
Listen, one of your great heroes and inspirations, Nelson Mandela. We can't get through a long interview without you saying what you think makes him so special.
Mandela was superhuman. He felt all the natural responses to the cruelties inflicted on him, both physically and spiritually. But somehow he managed to override all that, even when he was in a position of power, and he could have manifested his resentments and settled scores and paid off people. That I regard to be utterly, unrestrainedly admirable, simply because he was normal, utterly normal. And his only abnormality was his mercy and his wisdom. Extraordinary.
Neil, lovely to talk to you as ever.
Same here, mate.
It's been a great pleasure to have you. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Well, Alastair, thank you very much. It was interesting because it's the first time I've received emails from you saying one of the tricky things is that he's such a good friend and has been such a good friend for such a long time. You've got a slightly different manner towards him than I think you do toward almost anyone else. There's a certain sort of fondness towards him and a kind of gentleness comes out of you when you're talking to Neil. That
you
isn't
say you
true with
wasn't
everybody
fond
else.
with Tony?
Not the same gentleness.
Jonathan?
No.
Powell?
No. You're more sort of
David Miliband?
more cheeky with them, whereas there's a sort of gentleness, sometimes even a sort of almost a kind of filial deference towards him, which I haven't noticed with anyone else.
No, I don't think that. I think that I'll tell you what was happening, and if listeners and viewers are a little bit confused as to why Neil was clearly teary-eyed talking about Nelson Mandela, it's just because prior to that we'd been talking about Glenys. And we're not going to show that bit because he was in bits. And I just think that Neil is one of the most extraordinary guys I know. He's he's an amazing friend. We have been through an awful lot of ups and downs, and his family are amazing. And so, no, I didn't feel I was being more deferential. But if you spotted that. No, and I think it's just pity in a way that we didn't talk about Glenys, because I think you can't talk about Neil without talking about Glenys. They are one of the most formidable political partnerships. And she was a really amazing woman. I also, maybe I do think that, I think this with Tony, but Tony went on to be Prime Minister and won 3 terms and and what have you. I think that Neil's legacy is so bound up in what we did. And even though Tony always said and Gordon always said, at speeches and talk about Labour, the debt of gratitude we owe to Neil Kinnock, etc., 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 I think to have gone through what he went through and didn't get to be Prime Minister in the way that Wilson did and Callaghan did and Tony did and Gordon did and now Keir Starmer has, I think he has to be recognised in those terms. So, but it's interesting you thought that.
I'm sort of still processing this, but that 92 defeat, how devastating that must have been, given how viscerally Neil, you, everybody in the Labour Party felt about Thatcherism, felt about what she'd done to the country from 79 to 92. I mean, you must have felt this was a kind of profound moral campaign, so it must have been almost incomprehensible.
Well, I'll tell you a couple of things. On the way back, I can remember the next morning, we came back from Wales, and the next day I was just doing the round of media, because I was still a journalist then, on College Green. And there was a journalist called Peter Jenkins, who was a very, very well-known political commentator. And I remember I was doing a two-way thing with him, with the BBC, I think it was. And he said, I think the Labour Party has to understand that if it cannot win in these circumstances, it's probably never going to win again. And I remember thinking, 5 years later, we won a landslide.
Yep.
But the reason I think I can remember that is that really, really hit me. I thought, are you seriously saying this is like the death of the Labour Party? And I didn't feel it was, but you could see why people were thinking that. So it was absolutely visceral. It was visceral. And from a personal perspective, I'll never forget this either. Fiona and I went, I think it was the next night, we went round to Neil's house in Ealing. And up until then, there was this scaffolding outside because all the media had been hanging around just waiting for him to come back from Wales, pictures, etc., etc. The scaffolding was still there and all the media had gone. And we went inside, and I'll never forget it. Glenys was sort of making a cup of tea. Neil had his slippers on. And as you may know, Rory, I don't think slippers
as a look.
Not by the sort of look
not your look.
I appreciate.
No.
And he was literally sort of looking at the TV listings to see what to watch on television. And then this little holiday we had in Devon with Gavin Davis and Sue Nye and the first day we got there, Neil playing football with Rory, my Rory, who was then 5, and just thinking, how do you go from that to this and process it? And then going out and about, the funniest thing going out and about at that point was everybody coming up to Neil saying, I'm so sorry because I voted for you. And Neil saying, God, if they all voted in the way they said it, I'd be in fucking landslide by now.
So just finish. I mean, I thought what Neil said about the SDP was really fascinating. I mean, one of the things that I took from it is the sense that you can't just win in politics on the basis of exceptional individuals. In some ways, Roy Jenkins, David Owen, Shirley Williams would have seen themselves as really exceptional individuals, and they would have hoped that they were taking the real stars of the Labour Party over this new party, and that would be enough. And it wasn't enough. In the end, sheer organisation, party history, unions,
institutional memory,
skillful leadership by Neil destroyed these sort of great stars, intellectual stars.
So has Neil been added to your list of Labour heroes with Alan Milburn and others?
And people like David Blunkett, who I'm not sure he agreed with politically. No, I loved him. I thought he was so gentle and moving. I mean, I would say on record, I'm much more of a Tory than he is. I'm a bit suspicious about his views on privatization, deregulation. It all sounds very reasonable, but I imagine in practice, I'm probably a bit more pro-market, pro-business than he is. But as a human being, I thought he was absolutely wonderful, and I'm very proud that he was part of our political landscape.
Excellent. See you soon.